right that a lot of interreligious work, interfaith work, or even a lot of secular work is often assumed that if you're going to bring people from different religious traditions together, you have to find ways to minimize or even neutralize their religious differences and their religious disagreements if you're ever going to get to anything that might be called peace or constructive engagement. And I wrote this book in part as a growing, strong conviction that that is absolutely wrong.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore how religion is lived. I'm your host, Elaine Howard Ecklund. I'm a sociologist and director of the Baniak Institute at Rice University. Today we're going to be talking about interreligious peacebuilding, and it is my privilege to welcome John Barton to Religion Unmuted. John is the director of the Center for Faith and Learning at Pepperdine University, where he also has faculty appointments in the Religion and Philosophy Division, the university's graduate program on social entrepreneurship and change, and the Strauss Institute for Dispute Resolution at the Caruso School of Law. John's latest book is Better Religion, a primer for interreligious peacebuilding, published with Baylor University Press. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be a part of this conversation.
Well, let me just jump right in. I just want to start by focusing on your book. And what do you hope are the biggest takeaways for readers of Better Religion?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I wrote the book because I am convinced that interreligious peacebuilding is more important than ever in our world. And so I wrote this book to draw attention to that, to draw attention to the urgency, what I believe to be the growing urgency for interreligious peacebuilding, and to pursue what I call better religion, the better angels of different religious traditions, how we can imagine that, how we can mobilize that both within our own different traditions and imagine it across the world. And so that would be the elevator speech for why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Maybe just to move a little bit more personally, if I could, maybe tell us a little bit about how your own religious identity has had an impact on the work you do. And you're working at a very well-known university that is part of the historic Christian tradition, and you don't hide the fact in the book that you come from a specific faith tradition. So how has that had an impact on your work?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Yeah, certainly I do the work because I care about it and because I've had this kind of growing professional interest in religious diversity and religious interactions. But certainly I have a story that feeds all of this as well. And so to your point, I study religion as a religious person myself. I'm rooted in the Christian tradition, and that's not just something that I claim as an identity, but it's something that really frames my life and the things that are most important to me. And so part of what I'm really convinced of as I write a book like this and as I do interfaith work in general is that interfaith peacebuilding and interreligious peacebuilding is always better served when everyone in the room brings themselves to the table, that we don't check our religious identities at the door, that we come in as we are, and learning how to be rooted in a specific tradition, to draw on the resources of that tradition, and yet be open and humble and engaging and embracing of others in this bigger quest is part of my journey. So I would say, what's a short version of the way this kind of developed in my life. I grew up in a Christian nurturing home. While I went through my own journeys, as everyone does, of doubts and questions and explorations, as an adult, I found the Christian faith to be compelling and life-giving for me. I went to a conservative Christian university when I went to college, and then after that to seminary. And kind of making a long story short here, my wife and I found ourselves part of a team of people who decided to move to East Africa to do church work and to support faith communities. And we lived in East Africa for the better part of a decade. And I would say, even though by that point, I'd gotten a bachelor's degree and a master of divinity, my education really started when we moved to East Africa. And I really started to learn. For one thing, I started to encounter a lot of religious diversity, which would feed and shape my journey going forward. I do want to say one thing here that I think is important too. We moved to East Africa as young people. I was in my late 20s, wanting to do good in the world, but I was incredibly naive. And I don't, that's just what we went over with good hearts and naive souls in some ways. And today there's a lot of talk about savior complexes, and I think those critiques are right on target. In some ways I have to look back at my own experiences, what I was doing when I was 27, through a lens, sometimes through some critical lenses that I've gained later of what it means to go into other spaces with these kinds of efforts. And yet I think it's really important for me to say that at a conservative Christian university in the 1980s, we were encouraged to go not as answer givers, but as question askers. And we were really encouraged and trained to go to listen, to learn, to immerse ourselves in relationships with people. And so I would say when we moved to East Africa and spent our years there, we learned a lot of things, but two things in particular really had an impact on me and led to things like the writing of this book, Better Religion. One is that we found ourselves immersed in communities that lived daily with the challenges and the realities of poverty and corruption. And my seminary training didn't fully prepare me for that, or how to even think about it, or how to process it internally or anything else. But as we were there, actually very quickly, our church work developed into contexts of holistic service. Several years later, that turned into the development of a nonprofit organization that's now in its third decade, and I'm still intimately involved with that. It's called the Kibo Group. It's a asset-based approach to community development. And even now, 30 years later, I see myself as an ally and a supporting partner to these incredible people on the ground in places like Uganda that are working for their own community's development and sustainable development. So that's one thing that happened to us. The second thing is that we encountered, as I said, religious diversity. I was not fully prepared for that. East Africa, where we lived, and in Uganda, of course, a lot of African traditional religion. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. A lot of Islam. The area where we lived was about 20% Muslim. Of course, a lot of Christianity, post-colonial Christianity. But we also lived in an area of East Africa that had a lot of people for hundreds of years from India. And so there were a lot of Hindus and Sikhs and Jains. I was introduced to the Baha'i faith in East Africa. Uganda is one of the central points for the Baha'i faith in the African continent. I encountered African Jews, a group called Abayudaya in Uganda. And all of these things, as a young Christian, I was suddenly thrust into all these questions about how to understand these different groups, how to understand myself, how to understand this church work that we were doing. Should I understand these different religious groups as rivals, as competitors for souls, as targets of my own evangelism? Or could I see them, or even worse, as enemies? Or could I see them as friends and collaborators, as teachers? And all of that started to mix together with our development work, our sustainable development work, because we were working in communities that had religious diversity in the community as we tried to address issues like access to clean water, for example. And so all of that kind of combined in my own journey. While we were there, I also got a PhD from Makerere University, which is the National University of Uganda, in African and comparative philosophy, where I studied these things. And then when we moved back to the States in 2002, I became a professor. And since then, I've been studying and teaching and researching these things, all of these things around religious diversity, interreligious interactions, and the way that how we can think about collaborations for social change and social good. And so that's kind of I don't know if that's a short or a long version of the story, but that's how I was kind of shaped and directed in these ways.
It's a good story. Thank you for sharing it. And yes, what's coming to the surface for me right now is some of the things you didn't say. I didn't hear you say, I encountered these different religious traditions and then I decided not to remain in my own tradition of Christianity, or
right.
And I would say in my own experience in fears about religious diversity and fears about interreligious work, that sometimes some who are most sincere about their faith traditions feel like this sort of work will potentially lessen the sincerity of their own tradition. And so I see you as living very differently than that. And it's interesting to me and intriguing, and I think it's probably intriguing our listeners as well. You talk in the book, I think, in a really nuanced way about this, about how it's important to really face our religious differences head on, to not kind of, and I hope this doesn't sound too pejorative, but not dumb down to the lowest common denominator, which some in the most negative call it, or really let go of any sincerity of belief. So why do you believe it's essential to, how can I say this? Why do you believe it's essential to engage with religious differences rather than minimizing them?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think one way to get at that actually speaks to the first part, what you were commenting even before your question. I mean, I did go through my own, when I started to experience and encounter these religious differences around me, and I sensed that it wouldn't be genuine to just demonize these other groups, because I was making genuine friendships and relationships and seeing good people in these other groups. But then that causes you to kind of consider and think about yourself and why I am the way I am, why I believe what I believe, and is it justified, and all those things. So I went on my own journey with that. And I think I could honestly say that in the last 30 years of this work, while I've learned just unbelievable amounts about Islam and Hinduism and all these different traditions, and I have friendships and people that I represent with that learning, I learned even more about myself and about my faith, and I wrestled with it, and my faith didn't remain unchanged in that process. But kind of to shift toward the where your question was going, part of what that process did for me as I became more and more interested in interreligious peacebuilding and interreligious interactions is it created a growing sense in me that the importance that I put on my own faith and the way that it shapes me and the way that I find it compelling and the way I connect it to what I think is most important in life, that my colleagues and my friends in other traditions often feel the same way about their traditions. And so when we talk about truly loving each other, collaborating with one another, trying to find ways to engage with one another constructively in the world and for the world, it just became more and more apparent to me that the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we honor our differences. If we don't, and you're right that a lot of interreligious work, interfaith work, or even a lot of secular work is often assumed that if you're going to bring people from different religious traditions together, you have to find ways to minimize or even neutralize their religious differences and their religious disagreements if you're ever going to get to anything that might be called peace or constructive engagement. And I wrote this book in part as a growing, strong conviction that is absolutely wrong. That if we're really going to find ways to build peace in this world, we've got to do it while honoring, what Rabbi Sachs called the dignity of our differences. And so, in the book, one of the key metaphor that I use is that of a bridge. And, we talk about bridge building and building bridges to one another. One of the things that really struck me, and I try to explore a little bit in the book, is when you think about what a bridge is, a physical bridge, it's something that links together two shores that are otherwise not connected. And maybe there's even something impassable in between them, a river, a ravine, whatever it might be, a highway. But these bridges, because they have foundations strongly rooted on the different shores, can then build and extend beams toward one another and create some common ground in the middle where they can then cross. And to me, that became a really powerful metaphor for what I think good interreligious peace building needs to be, or at least how it can be imagined. is it's not that we need to dumb down or find the lowest common denominators across our religions and just kind of hope that we can build on those lowest common denominators and neutralize everything else, but that we can actually all lean into the deepest resources and the strongest convictions of our different religious shores, and do so in a way where we tap into different sides of religious divides, different sets of resources, different stories, rival versions of what is true, ultimately true. And yet from those different shores, we can actually find ways to build foundations to work toward one another.
That's wonderful. The role of religion, it strikes me in peace building is changing as time goes on. And I know you've talked about that some in your work as well, especially, of course, with the current global challenges and conflicts and just horrific global situation that we're in right now in several regions in the world. So why do you think religion is important to peace building, and how is it changing?
Yeah. Well, part of the subtext of my book is that religion continues persistently to be a powerful force in the world. And it can be a powerful force for better or worse. And sometimes the jury is still out. Religion can be a powerful force for destruction and for division. But I also think it can be a powerful force for good. And so, one of the ways I like to think about it, I mean, when you think about like the conflicts going on in our world, and by the way, many of the ones that we're talking about every day now had not yet ignited in their current form when I wrote the book. And so just in the last couple of years, I mean, the things that are happening, I mean, Israel, obviously, and Hamas, and that whole thing, I think it would be a mistake to say that that is a religious conflict. It's not a religious conflict. But religion is a very important ingredient that can't be ignored. I would even say it's an active ingredient, to borrow from the natural sciences. It's not just part of the mix. It's actually an active ingredient that can affect outcomes in really powerful ways. And certainly that's true in Russia and Ukraine and the war there and a lot of other places. But how is it changing? That I would say a couple things here. One is that one of the big things I've been watching since I wrote the book, and some of this is in the U.S., but I also see it elsewhere as well, is that we have a kind of what some people have called the big sort. I'll just talk about the U.S. context right now. That we have a ideological clustering that's starting to happen, that people are kind of pulling into their own ideological spaces and communities in ways that kind of leave others out. That Robert Putnam said that at one point that diversity kind of brings out the turtle in all of us, that we kind of draw back into our shells when we encounter diversity. I heard recently that, even more so maybe than just a turtle pulling back into its shell, that sometimes what we see happening is people pulling back like a crab. If you think of a crab backs into its shell with its claws out, it's a defensive posture. And when we encounter diversity, there's this human instinct, there's this natural instinct to pull back, and sometimes pull back with our claws up. And we see that happening in the U.S. right now. Not just ideologically, like you can be geographically very close to people, but be ideologically very far. But even geographically, if people that are following these trends. And so you see a lot of this sorting taking place. And I actually think that in all of that, of course, sometimes those ideologies get wrapped in religion and actually can take on more potent forms in religion, whatever side someone might be on. But I also think that religion has one of those unique abilities in our world today. It's one of the forces in the world today that can be an active influence that subverts actual kind of homogenization. It calls people, if people are really tied into a religious identity, even if they're wrapping that religious identity in some kind of political ideology, as people do on all sides, if you are immersing yourself in the religious literature and the religious traditions, there are those subversive seeds that get planted in us that continually call us to step outside of our affinity groups and to consider in humility other people and where they're coming from. And we're called to compassion or to love, to karuna, whatever concepts we might want to use here. and that religion can actually be a subversive element there. So one of the things that I see at play in the world right now is kind of the both and of the better or worse metaphors that I use in or language that I use in the book, is that religion is showing its darkest sides right now in many ways, in many of the conflicts abroad and at home. But when you look closely, there are all kinds of examples of these undercurrents and these grassroots movements, often of religious people that are subverting those homogenizing forces and still calling people to be peaceful. We all know examples of some of these things, but just to name one or two, I mean, with all that's happened since October 7th of last year, and the ripple effects across our world of the war between Israel and Hamas and all that's going on in Gaza, you still have this group like the Parent Circle Family Forum that's been around since the late 90s, that's made up of Palestinian and Israeli families, all of whom have lost people in the wars in the last 20 or 30 years. And you still have groups like that are doing deep-seated grassroots work for peace and for understanding. And this is a really, really difficult time for them to do that work, but they're doing it. And that kind of active ingredient work, I think, is so powerful.
Oh, that's wonderful. If our listeners are asking themselves, what can I be doing to use my religion to contribute to peace building, and especially to work with others from different religious perspectives and backgrounds, what would you say? What are just some practical ways that our listeners could get involved and be more thoughtful in what they're doing?
Yeah. Well, certainly all religious traditions have their own literature and their own resources that people can tap into. But one thing I would say is pay attention to, and I need to be reminded of this every day, to pay attention to and to give myself permission to notice and to be formed by those radical, subversive ingredients for peace that exist in our traditions, and to give voice and to give ourselves over to that. But then there are also a lot of practical things. I mean, there are organizations all over the place in different cities and different areas that give opportunities for things like this. This may not be anything that's especially unique, but I think of organizations like Interfaith America. I mean, they have a website with an unbelievable amount of resources, people from all kinds of different traditions. There are books that you can tap into. There are videos. There are events around the country. There are practical suggestions for how you can do interreligious or interfaith events in your own location, whether small scale or larger scale. One thing that I do tell, that I like to tell pastors and church leaders in the communities where I work, is also to not think that we have to reinvent the wheel every time. Like, oh, I'm inspired by this. I think how can I create an interfaith event? That's fine, and we need to do some of that, but there are a lot of people doing a lot of things, and sometimes it's the humility and the opening ourselves up to collaborating with people from other traditions that already have something going. And I find that to be very important.
Thanks for sharing that, and really appreciate you sharing that, and hoping our listeners take away some personal inspiration. We started at the beginning with asking you to tell a little bit about your personal story, and I want to end now asking you to tell a little bit about your personal hopes for the future. So what do you hope people take away from your story of your career and work? And I guess essentially, what do you hope people will learn from the way you're doing things?
Yeah. Well, I often say that with my, I teach undergraduate and graduate students at Pepperdine, and I engage with others, but kind of teaching and writing is my primary work in some of, as I think about this stuff, and trying to bring my activism into the classroom as well. Part of what I often say to my students is that I hope to model something that they find compelling, that they find inspiring, and that gives them permission. I think sometimes people within different religious communities struggle to feel like they have the permission to ask these kinds of questions, to to reach outside of their own communities and to ask questions that there may not be quick or easy answers to embrace people and start friendships that might complicate their own lives and their own convictions and their own sense of certainty for certain things. And I often tell my students, I want to grant you permission to ask and to explore and to embrace. And part of that, and I'll just speak from a Christian perspective, part of that for me is a deep kind of trust that if there's something to my faith that's true and that's right and that's compelling, if there is a God that calls us into service to the world, into humility, into stepping outside of ourselves for love of neighbor and even love of enemy, if those things are true, then there is nothing but growth and development to be gained by branching out and taking risks and asking big questions and embracing others. It's what we're called to. And so I hope that people will be inspired by this. They'll find something of what I say to be compelling, and that they will feel a little bit more like they're granted permission to do so faithfully.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. I hope that that listeners will keep in touch with your work and that they benefit from it as much as I have. That's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to, rate, and review us wherever you listen. And my special thanks to our guest, John Barton. Today's show was written by myself, Rachel Schneider, and Haley Hemstreet. Our series is produced by 3 Wire Creative. Religion Unmuted is a joint venture of the Baniak Institute and the Religion and Public Life Center, both at Rice University. I'm Elaine Howard Ecklund. Until next time.